For 24 years, a missing car sat beneath concrete in Ohio, and nobody knew that 3 teenagers were trapped below. For more than 2 decades, families searched for answers. Friends wondered what happened. A small community carried the memory of 3 young people who left home one night and never returned. The missing car was a silver Pontiac Grand Prix. It disappeared in 1992, along with Joseph Melanie, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bells. At the time, investigators had almost nothing to follow. There was no clear accident scene, no abandoned vehicle, no message, no evidence explaining where 3 teenagers and their car had gone. It was as if they vanished. But decades later, an unbelievable discovery changed everything. Hidden beneath an industrial building in Ohio, investigators found the missing Pontiac, the same car that had disappeared 24 years earlier. The discovery finally answered one of the biggest questions families had carried for years. Where did Joseph, William, and Nikki go? But finding the car did not end the mystery. It created new questions. Because when investigators finally opened that vehicle, they discovered evidence that suggested this was never just a simple disappearance. The car was found. The teenagers were found. But the full story behind what happened that night remained unclear. How could a missing Pontiac disappear for decades and end up hidden under an industrial foundation? How did nobody find it for so long? And what happened during the final moments before 3 teenagers vanished forever? This is the story of the Ohio case that remained unsolved for 24 years. A story about 3 families who waited for answers. A story about an investigation that seemed to reach a dead end. And a discovery beneath concrete that changed everything. It was a normal evening in May 1992 in Lincoln County, Ohio. Students were finishing school events. Friends were making plans. Families expected their children to come home like any other night. Nobody knew that the evening would become the final chapter of 3 young lives. The 3 teenagers were Joseph Melanie, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bells. They were friends with their own hopes, dreams, and plans for the future. Joseph was known for being quiet and responsible. He had a strong interest in automotive engineering, and his Pontiac Grand Prix was more than just a vehicle. It represented something important to him. It was connected to his future and the person he wanted to become. William was different in personality. He was funny, energetic, and loyal to the people around him. He was preparing to begin a career in construction and was looking ahead to the next stage of his life. Nikki was thoughtful and curious. She loved reading and traveling, and she dreamed about a future beyond the familiar streets of Lincoln County. They were teenagers preparing for a new chapter. Graduation was approaching. The future seemed open. But after a school event in May 1992, everything changed. That night, Joseph was seen with his keys. The silver Pontiac Grand Prix left the road with the 3 friends inside. Their destination was Miller's Lake. It should have been an ordinary trip. Instead, it became the last known journey of Joseph, William, and Nikki. When they did not return, their families immediately began searching for answers. At first, there was hope. Maybe they were delayed. Maybe something simple had happened. Maybe they would walk through the door the next morning. But morning came, and they were still missing. Their disappearance shocked the community because there were no obvious answers. They did not run away. They did not leave behind a clear message. They did not disappear without a trace alone. Their car disappeared with them. 3 bedrooms remained untouched. 3 families waited for a phone call. 3 families hoped for a knock at the door. But as the days passed, one question became impossible to ignore. Where did Joseph, William, and Nikki go? What happened between the road near Miller's Lake and their disappearance? At first, police believed the case would be solved quickly. They had no idea they were about to begin a search that would last for decades. Who they were before they became a mystery. Before Joseph Melanie, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bells became names connected to one of Ohio's most mysterious disappearances, they were simply 3 teenagers with ordinary lives. They had friends. They had families. They had plans for the future. And they had no idea that one night in May 1992 would change everything. Joseph Melanie was known as a quiet and responsible young man. He was focused on his future and had a strong interest in automotive engineering. For Joseph, cars were more than machines. They represented creativity, skill, and possibility. His Pontiac Grand Prix was something special to him. It was not just a way to travel. It was connected to his dreams and the future he was building for himself. William Hamilton brought a different energy to the group. He was described as funny, energetic, and loyal. He enjoyed being around people and valued his friendships. As graduation approached, William was preparing to start a career in construction. Like many young people his age, he was beginning to think about adulthood and the path ahead. Nikki Bells was thoughtful and curious. She enjoyed reading and traveling. She wanted to see more of the world beyond Lincoln County. Her dreams reached beyond the familiar places she knew. She wanted new experiences and a life filled with possibilities. Together, Joseph, William, and Nikki represented a normal part of a small community. They went to school. They spent time with friends. They looked toward the future. Their lives were not defined by the mystery that would later surround them. They were remembered as young people with personalities, goals, and people who cared about them. Then came the morning after they disappeared. For everyone who knew them, life suddenly felt different. Everything around them looked normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. Their beds were still made. Their belongings were still where they had left them. Their families were forced to face a question no parent ever wants to ask. Where are they? As the search continued, their families refused to give up. Joseph's father repeatedly drove the roads, searching for any sign that could lead him to his son. He looked through areas connected to the disappearance, hoping that one small detail could provide an answer. William's family worked to spread the word. They covered towns with flyers, hoping that someone had seen something important. Nikki's mother carefully followed every possible lead. Every phone call mattered. Every piece of information had to be considered. For the families, time did not make the uncertainty easier. They lived with unanswered questions. They waited for news that never came. Parents slept near their phones, hoping for a call. Porch lights stayed on, waiting for footsteps that never arrived. The community continued to search, but the answers remained hidden. The 3 teenagers had disappeared, and the missing Pontiac had disappeared with them. At this point, investigators were still trying to understand what happened. There were many possibilities. Maybe the answer was somewhere on the roads around Lincoln County. Maybe it was hidden in a place nobody had searched. Or maybe the truth was closer than anyone realized. Because while the families searched above ground, investigators were beginning to wonder if the answer was somewhere nobody had thought to look. The search that found nothing. When Joseph, William, and Nikki failed to return, police began looking into their disappearance. In the early stages, investigators considered several possibilities. Maybe the teenagers had left voluntarily. Maybe they had been involved in an accident. Maybe they would return after some time. But as the hours turned into days, those possibilities became harder to accept. There was no sign of the teenagers. There was no sign of the Pontiac. And there was no clear explanation for what had happened. The search quickly expanded. Authorities and volunteers looked through areas around Lincoln County. Bloodhounds were brought in. Helicopters searched from above. Divers checked possible locations in the water. Volunteers searched fields, roads, and nearby areas. Everyone was looking for one piece of evidence that could explain where the 3 teenagers had gone. But the search produced very little. There was no wreckage, no tire marks, no abandoned vehicle, no clear witness sightings. The lack of evidence made the disappearance even more confusing. Usually, investigators could follow something. A damaged vehicle, a witness statement, a physical clue. But in this case, almost nothing connected the teenagers to a specific location after they left that night. As time passed, different theories began spreading through the community. Some wondered if the teenagers had been kidnapped. Others considered the possibility of a carjacking. Some believed they may have run away. Others wondered if there had been a hidden accident that investigators had not discovered. But without evidence, every possibility remained only a possibility. The families continued searching. The community continued hoping. But eventually, the reality became harder to accept. The 3 teenagers were still missing. A memorial service was held. Instead of celebrating their graduation and future plans, their families, friends, teachers, and classmates gathered to remember them. 3 senior portraits represented 3 young lives that had suddenly disappeared. The case had become more than a missing persons investigation. It had become a community searching for answers. During the investigation, Detective David Kirby began looking closely at information connected to the disappearance. One detail caught his attention: a construction site near the area where the teenagers disappeared. Fresh concrete had been poured shortly after they vanished. The idea seemed almost impossible. A car buried beneath a foundation sounded like something that could only happen in a story. But investigators had to consider every possibility. Could the missing Pontiac have ended up beneath that concrete? Could the answer have been hidden in plain sight? At the time, there was not enough evidence to confirm it. The investigation continued. But eventually, the search began to slow. Funding disappeared. New leads stopped coming in. The years passed. And slowly, the case moved from an active investigation into a mystery. The town continued living. New roads were built. New buildings appeared. People moved forward. But the question remained: what happened to Joseph, William, and Nikki? Because some mysteries do not disappear. They become part of the place where they happened. A town that never forgot. Years passed after the disappearance of Joseph Melanie, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bells. The investigation had slowed. The search that once involved police officers, volunteers, and entire communities was no longer happening every day. But for many people in Lincoln County, the mystery never truly disappeared. The case became part of local history. People continued talking about the night the 3 teenagers vanished. They remembered the lake road. They remembered the missing Pontiac. They remembered the last known moments before Joseph, William, and Nikki disappeared. For some, the case became a reminder that answers were still missing. Even after decades, people still wondered what happened that night. Over the years, unusual stories connected to the area continued to keep interest alive. Some people reported strange radio interference near the quarry. Others talked about survey equipment acting strangely. There were also reports of unusual footprints near Miller's quarry. But these reports did not prove what happened. They did not solve the disappearance. They did not provide the evidence investigators needed. They remained unexplained events that added to the mystery surrounding the case. For investigators, facts mattered. And without clear evidence, the questions remained unanswered. But the disappearance continued to stay in people's minds. One person who never believed the case was truly finished was retired Detective Dale Rowe. Even after leaving active investigation work, he continued following old information connected to the disappearance. He looked back at earlier clues. He examined details from the past. He searched for information that others may have overlooked. Because sometimes, old cases are not solved because new evidence appears. Sometimes they are solved because someone looks at the old evidence in a new way. Meanwhile, the area around Lincoln County continued to change. The places connected to the disappearance did not stay frozen in time. Roads changed. Industrial areas expanded. Locations that once stood empty became covered by new development. Places that may have once held important clues slowly became harder to recognize. The landscape changed, but the mystery remained. For 24 years, the missing Pontiac and the 3 teenagers connected to it stayed hidden somewhere. The families had spent decades waiting. The community had spent decades wondering. And investigators had spent decades searching for an answer that seemed impossible to find. Then, in 2016, something happened that would finally bring the case back into the spotlight. A discovery beneath the ground would reveal that the answer may have been closer than anyone imagined. After all those years, one question remained. What if the answer had been sitting there the entire time? The ground finally speaks. In 2016, after 24 years of questions, a discovery was made that changed the case forever. It happened at the Dry Creek Industrial Park. Construction workers were working in the area when they discovered something beneath the surface. Something that should not have been there. Hidden under concrete was a silver Pontiac. At first, it seemed impossible, but investigators quickly began examining the vehicle. And then came the confirmation. It was the missing Pontiac Grand Prix. The same car that had disappeared in 1992. The same car connected to Joseph Melanie, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bells. After more than 2 decades, the vehicle that had vanished without a trace had finally been found. For the families, the discovery brought an answer they had waited years to receive. They finally knew where their loved ones had been. They finally had a place connected to their disappearance. But the discovery also created new questions. Because finding the car did not explain how it ended up there. Investigators began carefully examining what was inside the vehicle. Personal belongings were recovered. Evidence connected the car to Joseph, William, and Nikki. The discovery confirmed what families had hoped and feared for years. The 3 teenagers had been inside the missing Pontiac. After 24 years, their families finally received confirmation. But the investigation was not over. In some ways, it had only begun again. Investigators examined the condition of the vehicle. They looked for signs that could explain what happened on the night of the disappearance. But some details created more confusion. The car did not show signs of a high-speed crash. There was no major vehicle damage that matched a serious accident. No evidence clearly supported the idea of a simple roadway incident. Instead, investigators noticed details that suggested the vehicle may have been deliberately placed there. The position of the car and the concrete surrounding it raised questions. The pattern suggested that the vehicle may have been there before the foundation was completed. If that was true, then someone would have had to know where the car was placed, and someone would have needed access to the construction site. The investigation turned toward the history of the building project. Investigators reviewed construction records connected to the foundation. They found unusual gaps in the paperwork. Some documentation was missing. There were questions about parts of the approval process. These details did not provide a complete explanation, but they added another layer to the mystery. Former workers connected to the construction site were also examined. Investigators learned about reports of a late-night concrete pour. There were also questions about unusual instructions and equipment brought to the site without normal records. Each detail created another question. How did the car get there? Who knew about it? And why was it hidden beneath a building? The investigation began focusing on the possibility that someone may have known exactly where the Pontiac was placed. One person connected to the construction site was Paul Henders. Investigators looked into his connection to the area. Henders denied involvement, but investigators examined information connected to him as part of their effort to understand what happened. The discovery of the car changed the case. After years of searching for the missing vehicle, investigators finally had it. But having the car was not the same as having the full story. Authorities eventually suggested that the disappearance may have been the result of an accident. However, many people questioned whether that explanation matched all of the evidence discovered after the Pontiac was found. For them, important questions remained. The evidence raised doubts. The circumstances created uncertainty. And the mystery that had lasted for 24 years was still not completely solved. The car had finally been found. Joseph, William, and Nikki had finally been located. But the biggest mystery remained. How did the Pontiac get there? Answers that still hurt. After 24 years of waiting, the families of Joseph Melanie, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bells finally had answers. But those answers came with a deep emotional cost. For decades, their families had lived with uncertainty. They had searched. They had hoped. They had waited for a moment that might finally explain what happened. When the Pontiac was discovered, the mystery that had followed them for so long was no longer just a question. It became a reality they had to face. A memorial service was held to remember Joseph, William, and Nikki. Their senior portraits were displayed once again. Families, teachers, and classmates came together to honor the 3 teenagers whose lives had been cut short. For many people, the moment brought a sense of peace. After years of not knowing, their loved ones finally had confirmation. They finally knew where Joseph, William, and Nikki had been. They finally had a place connected to their story. But finding the truth also reopened decades of pain. The discovery brought back memories of the young people they had lost. It reminded everyone of the lives that had been waiting for answers. Investigators also recovered personal items connected to the three teenagers. Joseph's belongings were found. William's class ring was recovered. Nikki's bracelet was discovered. These small personal items carried a powerful meaning. They were reminders that behind the mystery were three real people. Three teenagers with families. Three teenagers with dreams. Three teenagers who were remembered and missed for 24 years. For the community, the discovery marked the end of one of Ohio's longest-running mysteries. A case that had shaped generations finally had an answer about where the missing car had been. But the discovery did not answer every question. There was no confirmed murder conviction. There was no complete explanation of exactly how the Pontiac ended up beneath the concrete. The investigation had revealed important evidence, but some parts of the story remained uncertain. For many people in Lincoln County, the case was closed on paper, but emotionally, it never truly felt finished. Because knowing where someone was found is not always the same as knowing everything that happened. The mystery beneath the concrete. The story of Joseph Melanie, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bells began like many ordinary stories. Three teenagers. Three families. Three young people with dreams for the future. Joseph wanted a future connected to automotive engineering. William was preparing for a career in construction. Nikki dreamed of seeing more of the world. They were not remembered because of the mystery. They were remembered because of who they were before they disappeared. For 24 years, their families waited for answers. For 24 years, a community wondered what happened on that night in May 1992. Then, beneath concrete in Ohio, the missing Pontiac was finally discovered. The car that had disappeared was found. The three teenagers who had been missing were finally brought home. But the discovery also left behind questions that may never be fully answered. Was it truly an accident? Was someone hiding the truth? Did the final explanation reveal everything that happened that night? Or were there still details that remained hidden? Some mysteries survive because people forget. Others survive because the truth was never completely uncovered. The case of Joseph, William, and Nikki is remembered because it contains both answers and unanswered questions. It is a reminder that behind every investigation are real people, families waiting, communities searching, and lives that deserve to be remembered. After 24 years, Joseph Melanie, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bells were finally found. Their story was finally heard, and their mystery beneath the concrete remains one of the most unforgettable cases in Ohio. Because sometimes the hardest mysteries are not the ones where we find nothing, but the ones where we find something and still do not know the whole truth.